This slide presentation is about nationalism to sectionalism and kind of what we're going to call the age of Andrew Jackson. And so it's an interesting time because nationalism started out bringing our country together and was quickly followed up by sectionalism that starts to tear our country apart. During this time in American history, the South was really changing. There were a lot of changes happening, and a lot of them had to do with an invention made by this man right here. Okay, his name is Eli Whitney, and he invented the cotton gin. And I'll write that up here so that you can see it because I believe it's in your notes. But he invented the cotton gin, and this is a picture of his invention, the cotton gin. Before this, it was kind of up to either the farmers or their slaves to pick the cotton. And what they had to do was pick the cotton, and they had these really, really sharp barbs on the bottom of them and then sharp seeds inside of them that you had to try and pull out of the cotton. And so it was really difficult to clean that cotton and turn it into something that you could make into t-shirts or fabric or whatever else you're trying to make out of cotton. And so it was this machine down here made the process much, much easier. All they had to do was take the cotton, they'd put it into this roller machine, and the roller machine had blades on it, and the blades would cut that cotton, would cut the fibers of the cotton, and the seeds would fall out to the bottom, and all that would be left is the raw cotton that you could make your material out of. And so people could process this like hundreds of times faster than they used to be able to. And so cotton became an extremely cheap thing to make, and a lot of people really wanted it because instead of picking these seeds out by hand, now all you have to do is turn a handle. Okay, and so this invention changed the South completely. The people were looking for more farmland for farming so that they could grow more cotton because it was easier to process it, and so they started to move out to the western part of the southern part of America. And then cotton became king. In the South, no longer was tobacco an option, no longer was anything else an option. Basically, all of the big farms were growing cotton to make as much money as they possibly could. Because they wanted more land to grow this cotton, they were also kicking the natives out of the native land. They were thinking, well, we need this extra land, we need to grow cotton, so you Native Americans just need to get out of here. We need this room, okay? And then the last thing that happened is it seems kind of weird, kind of counterintuitive, but what they needed more workers. And why would you need more workers if it's an easier job? Well, you need more workers because you're expanding your farm, you're expanding your operations. Because if you have more people processing the cotton, you can get more cotton, which allows you to have more money, buy more land, and that land can produce more cotton, which means you need more people to work the machines, which means you can make more cotton, make more money, and on and on and on and on and on. So, needing more workers meant they just took on more slaves and they started to buy more slaves. And the population went up because there was so much demand for the slaves. There were just so many slaves that were being brought into America at this time. Okay, and at the same time, the prices went up. And so the slaves became worth so much more than they were before. I think this is a really interesting point to make because it's important to understand that in the South, even where slavery was big and we think of everybody had a slave or whatever, and that really wasn't the case. Only the really, really rich farmers were able to afford to have a big amount of slaves. You know, some farmers might be rich enough to have one slave or two or a couple, but only the really rich ones had tons and tons of slaves. And so actually only about 1/3 of all the families had slaves. So no, not the majority of people did not have slaves in the South, but most of the people did support slavery. They were for it. And the reason they were for it is because they hoped that someday they would be able to be rich enough to own slaves themselves and make their farms that big and that successful. Okay. And the slave families themselves, the African American people who were slaves, they kind of faced some challenges. One of them was if they decided to get married, if a slave man and a slave woman decided to get married, that marriage was not recognized. And so the master could sell off the woman, could sell off the man, could sell off both of them to different places, and they would not be or have to be kept together because they had decided to be together and be married because it wasn't a legal marriage. Okay, and then also if those two had a kid, that kid was not their property. It was not their kid. It was the property of the master. So the master now owned that kid as a slave and could either keep him and work him as a slave there, or could sell him off to another place, and they may never see their kid again. And so these conditions, as well as a whole lot of other ones, started to lead to these rebellions. Okay, and it really started off with kind of refusing to work and breaking tools and working slow, but eventually the things got bad enough that they started to actually fight back. And Nat Turner was one of those people that fought back. And this was they're probably the most famous and one of the largest slave rebellions in history. Nat Turner was born on a Virginia plantation, and he learned to read and write and speak and everything because he was educated in the Bible, okay, in Christianity. And he said that he had a vision and that God came down and told him to free the slaves and to kill the white people, okay. And so he was told by God to do this, in his opinion. And so he would speak to other groups of African Americans, and they would come and they would meet out in the woods and they would have these church sessions. And so the masters were allowing them to come out here because it was their day to kind of celebrate their religion and do that. So they went out, and Nat Turner would talk to them. Well, what the white people didn't know is that Nat Turner was kind of organizing them to fight back and move across the South and attack some of these, slave owners. Okay, and so he started the most famous slave rebellion, and him and 70 followers, 70 people that he had gotten onto his side, went across with pitchforks and guns and whatever else they could do, and went from plantation to plantation, freeing the slaves and killing any of the white men, women, and children that they could find. And so ended up killing 55 white men, women, and children. And it's kind of interesting to look at this quote from Nat Turner, that he says, "We do not go forth for the sake of blood and carnage. We're not trying to just kill people. Remember, ours is not a war for robbery. We're not trying to steal anything. It's a struggle for freedom. We're just trying to get ourselves our freedom. We're trying to get African Americans their freedom." That he's basically saying, you treat us like property, and we're not property. But eventually, they did kind of run out of steam. They ran out of ammunition, and the militia was able to surround them, and 16 of his men were killed, and the rest of them were captured, and they were executed for their parts that they took in this rebellion. But it also caused a lot of different things. It caused a ton of African American slaves that were innocent, that didn't do anything, didn't attack anybody, to be punished. Some of them to be executed, many of them to be whipped. Okay, and it also caused a complete change in the laws and the ways that things worked for slavery. It took away a lot of the freedoms. It said they couldn't drink alcohol. They were not allowed to meet anywhere, even religious meetings anymore, without being in the presence of white men, along with many other laws that were very restrictive. So now in this setting, we need to think about kind of the things that were bringing us together as Americans. And the idea of us coming together as Americans came from this feeling of nationalism. And feeling of nationalism is a feeling of pride and loyalty in your country. So if you're feeling nationalistic as you're watching the Dream Team in basketball, you're saying USA, USA, you're all for them, and it's all about your country, and you're not really worried about your state or your part of the country. You're worried about your whole country in total. Okay, and so one of the plans that helped to kind of build this nationalism and get these people excited was a plan by Henry Clay, and he had a plan for helping every single part of the country and to make them stable as far as economy went, so as far as money went, and it was called the American system. The American system had three parts. First off, it was to establish a protective tariff, okay? And a tariff is a tax that you put on things that come in from another country. So if England is selling blankets and we have blankets here for sale in America. And American blankets cost $1.05, and English blankets cost $1. Okay, people are always going to buy that dollar one, that cheaper one. But if we put a tariff on England, and every time they sell a blanket here, they have to give us 10 cents, then they're going to have to raise their price to $1.10. And now America is the cheaper one, and people are going to buy those American goods. Plus, every time they buy those English goods, the government of America gets 10%, or 10 cents, I mean. And so it not only makes other countries' goods more expensive, but it makes it so that there's more money spent on American goods and the government gets money. Okay, so this is an idea to try and help out that whole country. Okay, the second thing that they did is establish a national bank. It was the second national bank of the U.S. And what had happened is the first national bank's charter had run out, and the state banks were in charge of everything. And the state banks were kind of doing a bad job. They were giving out too many loans, and they were causing inflation, and there was just a lot of issues with the state banks. And so there was a realization they needed to make as the second bank of the U.S. And so they did that, and they gave them a charter, which means they could stay open for 20 years. Just like the first bank of the U.S., it was a private bank, okay, and it took the time and effort to control the money supply. So there wasn't too much money out there, because if there's too much money out there, then prices will go up. That causes inflation, and that is a bad thing. Okay. The third thing the American system did was to improve transportation, and so they took that money from the tariffs, they took the government revenue, and they spent as much money as they could on building roads out west, as well as building the canals. One of the major ones was the Erie Canal, which is pictured right here. Okay, and the Erie Canal it moves west from the Hudson River in New York. Okay, and so this or the canal is essentially a river that we dig and make ourselves. Okay, so it's a human-made river. And they also put money into bridges. This feeling of nationalism was billed by the newspapers as something called the era of good feelings. And the era of good feelings really started with the fifth president of the United States, which was James Monroe. And James Monroe was a Republican. He was a Democratic Republican. He was the fifth president of the United States. Okay, and he went against the Federalist, and he just absolutely dominated him, just crushed him, and easily became the president. And after a little while, it didn't take very long, a few months, the Federalist Party lost all of its power and it actually disappeared. And so there was only one party, the Democratic Republican Party. And by the second time that he ran, he was unopposed. And so he's one of the few presidents in American history to get all of the electoral votes, because nobody else ran against him in his second term. But some of the things that happened during his presidency that we need to talk about are some of these landmark cases. There were big Supreme Court cases that were decided at this time, and they all kind of have their own reasons. So make sure you're writing down more than just what's on the slide. Okay, and so McCulloch versus Maryland is the first one. And the McCulloch versus Maryland says that, or the issue was, the national bank was operating in Maryland. Okay, and Maryland was trying to put a tax on that national bank. And what the Supreme Court and the national bank said, no, we're not going to pay it. And so the Supreme Court looked at this case and they said, you know what, the state banks can't tax the national banks. That's not that doesn't work out. Okay, we can't have the states having that much power over the federal government. And as a matter of fact, they said that the states can't even make a law that violates the federal law at all. And so that was a really big deal, because they still use that today in deciding if state laws are constitutional. Now, the second landmark case was Gibbons versus Ogden. And what happened here is New York tried to give a New York company a monopoly on using a river. Okay, and the problem is this river route that they tried to give them a monopoly on had stops in New Jersey, so it was part of New York's commerce as well as New Jersey's commerce, their economy. Okay, and so it had to deal with two states. That's what interstate means. It has to deal with two or more states, and the government stopped that from happening. They wouldn't allow this to go through. And so they had to decide, is this constitutional or not for the governor or government to do this? And they decided that it was constitutional because anything dealing with two or more states will be regulated by the federal government instead of those two states having to work together. Okay. And then the last one is Dartmouth College versus Woodward. And Dartmouth College versus Woodward, what happened here is the state was trying to change Dartmouth College's charter. But what they said is Dartmouth College's charter is a private contract between a business and, the students, which are, maybe you see them as employees, maybe you see them as customers, whatever it is, okay? But it's a private contract, and they can't do that. So they basically said the state can't step in and just change private contracts. And what that does is it promotes capitalism, keeps the government out of the economy, and it lets the strong businesses get strong and the bad businesses die. The next thing we need to talk about is how our borders were changing at this time. And the next slide will be a map, and I'll kind of show you where these things were. But I would just want to say them real quick first. The first Rush-Bagot Agreement was an agreement with England deciding where our northern border would be, because sometimes we were thinking it was way, way, way up high, and we wanted to take a big chunk of what is now Canada, and they thought sometimes that it was way, 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 way low, and they would take parts of Minnesota and parts of these states that we know as the U.S. today. And so we agreed that the 49th parallel was going to be our northern border, and that's the border that you think of right now, where the line is straight in the western part of our country. That's the 49th parallel, and I'll show you it on the map on the next slide. The other thing that was happening is there was a lot of tension with Spain, because Spain's grip was starting to get weaker and weaker and weaker, and they owned like the entire western part of the U.S. and Florida, and it was really, really weak in Florida. And what was happening is escaped slaves were running down into Florida, and they were joining the Seminole tribe, and then the Seminole tribe would run up into Georgia and attack and steal stuff and hurt people and all that kind of stuff in Georgia. And so America was sick of it, so they sent Andrew Jackson, one of their really, really good generals. Turns out he's kind of a little crazy, he just keeps doing crazy things, but Andrew Jackson, they sent him in, and he was sent in to stop those Seminole raids. And so he started to follow the Seminoles, and he's running in there, and all of a sudden he comes to the edge of Florida, and he realizes, well, I'm going into Spanish territory, so that's kind of an act of war. But he went anyways. He didn't care. He just wanted to stop the Seminole raids. That was what he was sent to do. And so President Monroe said, okay, go into Florida. That's fine. Just don't confront the Spanish. Don't fight the Spanish. Don't get in their way. Don't do anything like that. Just take care of the Seminoles, and that's it. Okay. Well, what he ended up doing is he took two major Spanish cities, took them over completely, and then he also forced the Spanish governor to run away from Florida, to flee. Okay, and so basically Andrew Jackson had taken over Florida. And so what happened is James Monroe's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? This guy goes down there and he just takes it over on his own without my permission or anything like that. And so he had to act like he told him to do it. And so James Monroe said, we are going to you need to either police the Seminoles and take care of it so they quit attacking us, or you just need to give Florida to us so we can handle it. Okay? And Spain was so weak at that time that they knew they couldn't handle it, and they knew that we could easily take it away if the Seminoles kept attacking. So they just signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, and they said, you know what, we're going to give you Florida, and we're going to give up our claims to Oregon, because all three of Spain, England, and the United States all wanted or thought that they owned Oregon. So I just wanted to look at this map to point out a couple of things. The Rush-Bagot Agreement made this line right here, the 49th parallel. the northern border. It doesn't count over here because all of this was already established before that point, but all of the new land, it was going to be the 49th parallel. And then the Adams-Onis Treaty made it so that they gave us Florida, and they also completely gave up any claim they had to this. And so now we were just fighting about Oregon with Britain. So within a few years of when nationalism really started to build up our country and build up pride and agreement in our country, sectionalism took over and it started to tear it apart. Okay, and sectionalism, instead of being loyalty toward your whole country, is just loyalty towards your part of the country. Okay, and so that loving feeling and that together feeling started to break apart, and instead it was, I want to watch out for the South, or I want to watch out for the North. And so really there were three kind of areas that have different goals, and one of them was the Northeast, and the Northeast was all about manufacturing. They wanted their factories to be good, and they wanted to keep trade open with the countries of Europe. And they also, many of them were against slavery. In the West, they didn't care about slavery, they didn't care about any of that. All they wanted was cheap land so that they could build their farms up and good transportation. They wanted more roads, more canals, all that kind of stuff. And then in the South, their big dependence was on slavery. And so slavery was the most important thing to them. So while this sectionalism is happening, Missouri is ready. They have applied, they've gone through being a territory, they have the right amount of people, they're ready to go, and they are ready to become a state in the United States. But the problem is that they wanted to be a slave state. They really did. They wanted to come in, they wanted to have slavery, they wanted all of that. But the problem was there were 11 slave states and 11 non-slave states. And so if one more state jumped in and said that they were slavery, then all of a sudden the slave states would control the government. And if one more, they didn't let them in slavery, but if they let them in non-slave, then the non-slave states would control the government. So they really couldn't do it. So there was a really big argument over whether Missouri should be allowed in as a slave state or not be allowed to be a slave state. It was back and forth and back and forth. And then this man right here, Henry Clay, which we talked about earlier with the American system, he came in with a compromise, and he's known as the Great Compromiser. He has come up with many compromises, many of which we'll learn about in this class. But really, he's probably the best politician that will not become president. He tries many times, but he just can't ever get through. And so he came up with this compromise called the Missouri Compromise. And he said, here's what we'll do. We are going to bring Missouri in as a slave state because that's what they want. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add Maine as a state up here. Okay, and Maine is going to be a non-slave state. That way we keep our balance. And the other part of it to make the North happy was that he said in all the new states that we have, in all of these territories, there will be no more slavery allowed above the southern border of Missouri. So above this line that I'm just drawing on the map right now, there was not supposed to be any more slavery allowed. And with sectionalism tearing this country apart, there were a lot of worries about that. Okay, and there were other worries happening as well. The first one was a worry that Thomas Jefferson had. He wasn't president anymore. He wasn't involved in the government. He was an old man by now. But he was very worried about sectionalism. He saw that as a bigger threat to the country than anything that he had dealt with or any other president had dealt with in the past. He saw the country as breaking apart. Okay, we were also, as a country, worried about other countries coming in because Spain was being kicked out of all of these areas. They were being defeated in South America. They were being defeated in Mexico. They were being defeated kind of everywhere and taken out of North America. And we were worried other countries would come in and help Spain get their power back, or that they would come in and take that spot instead of those countries being free or us getting to take it. So we're worried about that. And so, Monroe and then his Secretary of State, who was John Quincy Adams, they talked about it, and Britain was trying to team up with the U.S. and say we should talk to the European countries and tell them they can't come in here at all. But John Quincy Adams said, it would be more powerful for America if we didn't involve Britain at all and we just said it ourselves. And so he wrote the Monroe Doctrine and sent it out saying basically that the Americas, so North and South America, as well as the middle countries between the two, are closed to colonization. So no European countries can come over and mess with the countries that are in North America and South America. Okay, and so we will protect them. If you come close to us, then we will attack you and we'll fight alongside them. For the same reasons, we're also going to stay out of Europe. We're not going to come over there and try and attack you or mess around over there. So now we'll transition away from Monroe in that era of good feelings and kind of get into a little bit more negative times. Okay, and that will be with the sixth president, John Quincy Adams. And so what was happening at this time is there were four people running for president. There was John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, was trying to be president, Andrew Jackson, which many of you know as that general, okay, as well as a man by the last name of Crawford from Georgia. Okay, now the fighting or the election happened, and Andrew Jackson had gotten most of the votes, more than anybody else, but he didn't have a majority. He didn't have enough to be given the presidency, and so the top two vote getters had to be decided by the House of Representatives. Okay, and the top two vote getters were John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay wasn't anymore, but he was Speaker of the House, and so he had a really big influence in the House of Representatives, and he didn't like the way Andrew Jackson did things, and so he told the House of Representatives to vote for John Quincy Adams, and so they did, and John Quincy Adams won. Well, the problem became that after that, John Quincy Adams saw Henry Clay as a very, very good politician, which he was, and so he actually hired him on as his Secretary of State. And so from then on, every time that Andrew Jackson could talk to anybody, he was talking about how Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams had cheated and won the election because Henry Clay had used his influence to get John Quincy Adams in just so that he could get position of power like the Secretary of State, right? And so that they were corrupt bargainers, they were cheaters, and so everything they tried to do was met by Andrew Jackson out there, which a lot of people liked, saying, he's a cheater, he's a cheater, he's a cheater, and so they couldn't get anything done really during that entire presidency. And the second time around, Andrew Jackson faced John Quincy Adams again and used this idea of John Quincy Adams being a cheater and won quite easily in his second attempt at being president. Andrew Jackson was extremely popular. His whole idea was kind of to make it more democratic and be seen as just like a regular guy like everybody else. Okay, and so one story that kind of really highlights this is he had a party after his inauguration, and he opened the White House for just any random people to come in and party with him, basically. And, there's a lot of alcohol, and so a lot of people were drunk, and they started to break the furniture in the White House, like this historic, important furniture. They started to break it. It was completely crazy, and the staff in the White House saw it getting completely out of control, and so they had to figure out, how do we get these people out of here? We need to get them out. The president let them in, but we need to get them out somehow, and they wouldn't leave. And so what ended up happening is the staff of the White House took all of the alcohol and beverages and food and everything and put it out on the White House lawn. And then whenever somebody left, they wouldn't let them back in. So all these people went out to get more drinks, and they weren't allowed back in, and that's how they got them to leave the White House. So kind of a funny story, but it shows you that, Andrew Jackson was just kind of a regular guy, and he was trying to get, he had these people on his side that weren't the most civilized, weren't the fancy people in America. And he dealt with three major challenges. Okay, and we'll go, each one will have its own slide or two. Okay, but his three major challenges that he dealt with was, what do we do about the natives? What do we do about states' rights? And what do we do about the national bank? So when Andrew Jackson thought about the natives, he really saw them as a people who were kind of in his way and had been conquered. We had defeated them. And so he thought, when you're in a war and you conquer someone, they have two options. They can either follow your rules and be like you are, become like us, follow the laws of our states, do all the things like white people do, or they can get out of our way. Okay, they can move to the west. They can move to the areas where we have set aside this Indian land for them. Okay, and so he ended up putting together kind of an idea more than an actual law called the Indian Removal Act. And this idea was to, as quickly as you could, negotiate treaties with the tribes that made the natives move. And these treaties were kind of crazy. They were really forced on people. It was kind of the idea of, you can either sign this treaty to move, or I can kill you all. Okay, and so it was this idea of, like, they had no other option other than to sign the treaties to move. And they were forced to move to this area called the Indian Territory. Okay, and the Indian Territory was mostly Oklahoma, and it had small parts of Kansas and Nebraska as well. And what it was this big piece of land that was really dry and grassy, and it didn't really grow the kind of crops that we were looking for. So we saw it as kind of useless land that was really hard to live on. And so what we did is we said, all right, Native Americans, you have to go live in this area. We're giving it to you. We're so nice, except for we're actually giving them land that we think was garbage. And so during this treaties, the Cherokee people, some of them had signed the treaties, the leaders, but most of the Cherokee people just said, no, we're not leaving. All right. So what ended up happening is, it actually happened after Jackson had left office. It was soon after there when Martin Van Buren took over. But they just sent some troops. They sent 7,000 troops, and they rounded up all the Cherokees, just pulled them out of camps, and they took them from their homes. They basically only let them take whatever they could carry, and they started to walk with them and make these 16,000 people walk out to the west to the Indian Territory, thousands of miles, during winter. Okay, and during this winter, it was a particularly bad one, and there was sleet and snow and winter storms, and people were dying. These natives were dying on their way over there because they didn't have, some of them didn't have appropriate clothing, didn't have shoes, were old, and so they were having a hard time keeping up, and they were literally dying. It was absolutely insane. And so about a quarter of them, or 4,000 people, died on that walk from their own land in Georgia and the surrounding areas all the way out west to Oklahoma. So 4,000 of the people died. And so it's known today as the Trail of Tears, because it was such a horrible experience. The second big issue that Andrew Jackson dealt with during his presidency was something called the Nullification Crisis. Okay, and basically what was happening with the Nullification Crisis is that there was a tariff, which we talked about before, and the tariff basically hurt the South and it helped the North. And so the South wanted to get rid of it. They wanted to nullify it. That's why it's called nullification. And so they were for the nullification. They wanted more states' rights. They didn't want the federal government to be able to make a tariff that hurt them. And the North said, well, the tariff's good, it helps us, so we would like the country to be more powerful and be able to make these tariffs. So that was kind of the battle. And what ended up happening when it went to the Supreme Court is the federal government was protected. They were allowed to make these tariffs if they wanted to. And South Carolina got mad. And South Carolina, they're kind of the baby of all the states. They're the first ones to always say, well, then I'm leaving. They're the ones that throw a fit. And so they threatened to do that. They threatened to secede. And secede means to break apart from the rest of the country and become their own country. South Carolina said, I'm out of here. We're not going to go through with this. We don't want this tariff, and so we want to split off and become a different country. And so Andrew Jackson got so mad at this idea that he said, you are treasonous, that is treason to break apart from this country, and so the next person to threaten this, the next person to do this, I will come down there with a rope and I will hang that man myself, which is kind of scary coming from this huge war general that Andrew Jackson was, this war hero. Okay, and so he obviously was very much for the federal government being protected, and that's what ended up happening under Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson's last big struggle was with the National Bank, and Andrew Jackson hated banks because his father had lost a bunch of money by taking loans from a bank, and so he kind of had a bad taste in his mouth about it too. But he also distrusted rich people, and a lot of bankers had gotten really, really rich, and so the National Bank, it was about to come up for renewing its charter. So remember, the charter is like letting it exist. And so Congress decided they wanted to renew the bank's charter, and they wanted to renew it 4 years early. They thought it's going good, let's keep it going, let's not worry about it later, let's take care of it right now. And Jackson, as soon as Congress had said yes, we're going to renew it, we'd like to add more years on, Jackson vetoed it. And so he killed the bill, and there was no more bank, right? And a lot of people were upset about this, especially in Congress, because they said the bank is what's best for our nation. They control our money supply. They avoid inflation. They avoid all the bad things that can happen in our economy. But the people stood behind Jackson because they loved him so much. But, of course, his second term came to an end, and in 1836, someone that he handpicked became the 8th president. He wanted this person to become the president. It was Martin Van Buren. And Martin Van Buren totally got screwed over by the decision of Andrew Jackson to eliminate the National Bank. Because what happened is there was inflation. Okay, people started to, there was more money in the system, and so the prices started to go up. And when the prices start to go up, that's when you need a national bank. You need the national bank to control those prices so they stay under control and don't get to terrible rates of inflation where the economy can just totally go down. And so the problem was there was no bank. There was no national bank anymore because Andrew Jackson had vetoed it and gotten rid of it. And so the British were buying less cotton, and so the cotton farmers' loans were starting to come up, and they had to pay the banks back, and they had no money, and so those loans failed. And so what happened is some banks in the South failed. When those banks in the South failed, people went in to take their money out, and the bank was closed, and all of their money was gone that they were trying to keep safe in that bank. And so people that weren't in those banks that failed got freaked out, and they went and ran and grabbed all their money out of the bank. Well, the way a bank makes money is they keep your money, they take your money, and they keep some of it, but then the rest of it they loan out to other people and make interest. And so they don't have all the money for everybody who wants to. If everybody came in and take their money out at the same time, they would run out of money, and then they would go out of business, and some people would not get their money back. And so all these people ran to the banks to try and take their money out, and those banks failed because the people panicked and ran there and tried to take their money out. And so the economy just fully collapsed because these banks started to fail one after another, which caused more panic and more people to run there to the banks, which caused more banks to fail, which caused more panic, and it was this big cycle. Okay, this time, all of these negative things in the environment were known as the Panic of 1837, and it was made worse by the fact that they did not have a national bank to help fix it. And so with the failures that Martin Van Buren had as the Democratic Republican, a new political party came to be. Okay, and this new political party was called the Whig Party, and it was completely against Andrew Jackson. They were named after the British Party, who used to exist in England, who was against royal rule, against a king and a queen. And so they did not like the idea of a whole bunch of power in one person, in a president. And they called Andrew Jackson King Jackson. That's what they called him, because they thought, well, he acts like a king. He just does whatever he wants. When he's told not to go into Florida, he goes in there and takes it over. When somebody threatens to secede, he threatens to go down there and kill them himself. I mean, he makes these decisions which, the rest of Congress don't agree with, and it doesn't matter. He seems to have all of the power, and they didn't like that. So they made a whole new party, and this Whig Party is the very first start of today's Republican Party. So these Whigs will eventually kind of form into the Republican Party. And so after all of the failure with Martin Van Buren, the next election came up, and there was a man by the name of William Henry Harrison who ran for the Whig Party against Martin Van Buren. Well, Martin Van Buren had sucked so bad that if you look down here at this, I really like this one. It says, "Vote Whig, Whigs to the rescue. They couldn't possibly be any worse." So they really didn't even, it didn't matter who they ran, it didn't matter what they said. Nobody was going to pick Martin Van Buren again after everything had failed when he was in office. They all blamed him. But the candidates that he went against were William Henry Harrison and John Tyler. Both of them were war heroes. And remember, William Henry Harrison was the leader, the general, the person in charge of the Battle of Tippecanoe that we talked about before. And so their phrase, their slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. That's how they tried to get you to vote for them. Okay, and they won. They won against the incumbent, who was Martin Van Buren. And that word incumbent just means the president who was in there before. Okay, who was already president, and they're trying to get reelected. And the way that they did it is they emphasized the personalities. They had like parades and dances and stuff like that where they would bring everybody in, and they called it a log cabin campaign because they said, William Henry Harrison's just a normal guy, kind of like Andrew Jackson. You could easily see him living out in the woods in a log cabin, just like a lot of people who are voting today.